The people of the West often said a home was where a man hung his hat. But the truth was different. A real home was where someone waited for you to return, where a lamp stayed lit after dark, where a voice called your name when you stepped through the door. Rose Whitmore no longer had such a place. She stepped down from the last train that stopped in Copper Creek, Wyoming, with dust on her boots and a worn suitcase in her hand. The train pulled away behind her with a long whistle, dragging its shadow across the empty platform like a dark ribbon. When the sound faded, silence settled over the town. Rose stood there alone. For 3 days she had walked every street in Copper Creek asking for work. Her feet ached, and her throat was dry from repeating the same words again and again. The boarding house turned her away the moment they saw she had no husband with her. The laundry shop said they already had enough help. The general store owner did not even let her finish her sentence before shaking his head and pointing her back toward the door. People in towns like Copper Creek did not trust a woman who arrived alone. They trusted even less when she had an Eastern accent and no family to speak for her. Rose felt like a small sparrow that had flown into a den of wolves. But what hurt the most was the money she had lost. $47. 2 long years of saving every coin she could while working in the loud spinning mills of Lowell. 2 years of sore hands and tired nights. 2 years of dreaming about a better life. All gone. The man who took it was named Hector Finch. His letters had been warm and gentle. His promises had sounded honest. He wrote about his ranch in Wyoming and how lonely he felt living so far from the world. He wrote about marriage and about building a life together. Rose believed every word. But when she arrived in Copper Creek, Hector Finch was gone. No ranch, no house, no man waiting with flowers like he promised. Only silence and the ugly truth that she had been fooled. Now the last of her money had disappeared on a cheap room and meals that lasted only a few days. Her suitcase felt heavier with every step she took. She stood on the empty platform, watching the train vanish into the distance. Then she heard something. Slow footsteps. Heavy ones. The kind of footsteps that made the whole street grow quiet. Rose turned her head. Across the dusty street, the swinging doors of the saloon opened. A tall man stepped out into the sunlight, leading a chestnut horse by the reins. The men standing near the water trough stopped talking. An old man sitting on a porch slowly rose and slipped inside his house. Even the horses tied along the street seemed to shift uneasily. The stranger moved with calm, steady steps. He wore a dark hat pulled low and a worn coat that had seen many hard seasons. A deep scar ran through one eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. His eyes were cold and pale, like winter creek water. He did not look angry. He did not look kind, either. He simply looked like a man who carried silence around him like armor. Rose heard someone whisper behind her. Bo Callahan. She had heard the name during her first day in town. The stories about him were not kind. Some said he was dangerous. Others said he had a temper that could turn deadly. Every version ended the same way. Decent women stayed far away from Bo Callahan. But desperation has a strange way of pushing fear aside. Before she could stop herself, Rose stepped forward and moved directly into his path. The chestnut horse snorted loudly and tossed its head. Bo steadied the animal with one calm hand. His eyes lifted slowly and settled on Rose. Up close, he looked even harder. His face was carved with lines from years of sun and wind. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rose forced the words out. "Mister," she said softly, "I am not asking for charity. I am offering a deal." Bo watched her without blinking. The entire street seemed to be watching too. "I can cook," Rose continued. "I can clean, I can mend clothes and keep house. I just need a roof over my head." Still nothing. Bo Callahan stood there studying her, as if trying to understand why she had stepped into his world. Finally he spoke. His voice was rough and quiet. "You don't know me." "No, sir," Rose said, "but I know I got nowhere else to go." For a moment the wind stirred the dust between them. "And you look like a man who is not planning to stay in town long," she added. Something flickered in his eyes. Not kindness, but not anger either. Bo glanced toward the boarding house across the street. A curtain shifted quickly where someone was watching them. Then he looked back at Rose's hands. They were rough and scarred from years of factory work, hands that knew hard labor. "There's a meal house across the street," he said finally. "I'll buy you supper. You tell me your story." He turned and began walking. "Then we'll see." Rose hurried after him before he could change his mind. Inside the small meal house, the air smelled like bacon grease and boiled beans. Flies tapped against the windows, and the wooden floor creaked under every step. Bo chose the darkest table in the corner. Without asking, he ordered 2 bowls of navy bean soup. Rose waited until he lifted his spoon before touching her own. He noticed, but said nothing. After a few quiet minutes, he spoke again. "Name's Bo Callahan. Rose Whitmore." He repeated her name slowly, as if testing the sound of it. Then she told him everything. She spoke about the mills in Massachusetts where the machines roared day and night. She told him about her husband Thomas, who died from typhoid only 2 years after their wedding. She spoke about saving money and dreaming of a new life in the West. And finally, she told him about Hector Finch and the letters that promised marriage. When she finished, her hands rested flat on the table. Bo looked at her for a long time. "You got family back east?" he asked. "None that want me." "Friends?" "Not anymore." Bo wiped the last of the soup with a piece of bread. "The place I live is 2 hours from here," he said slowly. "A small cabin my ma built with my pa." Rose's heart began to beat faster. "She passed 2 years ago," he continued. "Been alone there since." Rose waited. "I ain't looking for a wife," he said. "Not the way you mean." Her chest tightened. "But I could use someone to keep house," he added. "Cook. Take care of what my ma left behind." He met her eyes. "You get a roof, food, safety." Rose swallowed. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me." Bo looked down at his scarred hands. "My ma came west the same way you did," he said quietly. "Answered an ad and traveled halfway across the country to marry a stranger." He pushed a few coins across the table. "She used to say the West ain't kind to folks who don't help each other." He stood up. "We leave in an hour." 2 hours later, they rode away from Copper Creek. The land stretched wide and empty beneath a sky that seemed to go on forever. Rose held the saddle tightly as the horse climbed a rocky ridge. She had never seen so much open space in her life. It felt like the kind of place where a person could disappear or start again. When the cabin finally appeared beside a small shining creek and a row of willow trees, something stirred inside her chest, a fragile feeling, something close to belonging. That first evening, Rose stepped inside the cabin slowly. Dust drifted through the golden light of a single window. A faded quilt covered the bed. A rocking chair stood near a small iron stove, and on a wooden shelf rested a photograph of a gray-haired woman with kind eyes. Bo appeared quietly in the doorway behind her. "It's a good house," Rose said. "My ma built most of it," he answered. Rose touched the quilt. She had good hands. Bo's jaw tightened. "Yeah," he said softly. "She did." That night, Rose lay under the quilt, listening to the creek whisper outside the window. Somewhere during the night, she heard Bo rise and walk across the porch. She stared at the ceiling until morning. The days that followed moved slowly. Rose cleaned the cabin, cooked simple meals, and mended worn clothes. Bo left before sunrise and returned after dark. Some days, they spoke only a few words, but the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt like something waiting. One morning, he took her down to the creek and showed her deer tracks pressed into the mud. Another day, he pointed out wild onions growing along the ridge. The land began to speak to her in small, quiet ways. Then, one evening, she placed a fresh tablecloth she had sewn across the wooden table. Bo sat down and stared at the yellow flowers she had stitched into the fabric. He said nothing, but something in his expression softened. Later that night, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. For the first time since arriving in the West, Rose felt something she had not felt in years. Peace. But far away beyond the mountains, dark clouds were already beginning to gather, and neither of them knew that within days, the entire valley would face a danger that could wash everything away. The next morning, the valley felt different. Rose noticed it the moment she stepped outside the cabin. The air carried a strange stillness. Even the creek that usually whispered over the stones sounded slower, quieter, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Bo was already awake. He stood on the porch railing with a tin cup of coffee in his hand, staring toward the northern mountains. Rose wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped beside him. "What is it?" she asked. Bo did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the distant peaks. "Look at the birds," he finally said. Rose followed his gaze. High above the valley, dozens of birds were flying in the same direction. They were not gliding or circling like usual. They were moving fast, pushing hard toward the east, as if something behind them was chasing them away. Even the small herd of buffalo that sometimes grazed near the lower meadow had begun climbing toward higher ground. Rose felt a chill crawl up her spine. "They know something," she whispered. Bo nodded slowly. "They always do." He took another sip of coffee, but did not finish it. Instead, he set the cup down on the porch rail. "Snow's been melting heavy in the high country," he said. "Ground's too dry to soak it up." Rose looked back toward the mountains. Thick, dark clouds were gathering above the peaks. Not storm clouds. Something heavier. "When that water breaks loose," Bo continued, "it's going to run straight down the canyon." Rose felt her stomach tighten. "Copper Creek," she said quietly. Bo nodded again. "The creek runs right through the middle of town." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Bo turned and walked inside the cabin. Rose stood there listening as he moved quickly through the room. When he came back out, he carried his saddlebags and his rifle. Her heart sank. "You're going to town. Someone has to warn them." Rose crossed the porch and grabbed the fence rail. "They won't listen to you," she said, "after everything they say about you." Bo tightened the saddle strap on the chestnut horse. "Probably not." "Then why go?" He paused with one boot in the stirrup. The wind shifted across the valley, carrying a faint smell of wet earth from far away in the mountains. Bo looked at her then. For a brief moment, the hard quiet in his eyes softened. "Because it's the right thing," he said. Rose's fingers tightened on the fence. "Will you come back?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. Bo studied her face for a second. The question was simple, but the meaning behind it was clear. "Yes," he said. He reached to his belt and pulled out his Colt revolver. Then he handed it down to her. "In case I'm late." The gun felt heavy in Rose's hands. She wanted to say something more, something that might keep him there, something that might explain why the thought of him riding away made her chest ache. But the words would not come. Bo nodded once, swung into the saddle, and kicked the horse forward. Within seconds, he disappeared over the ridge. Rose stood there long after the dust settled. Then she walked back to the porch and sat in the wooden chair with the colt resting in her lap. The sky slowly darkened. The birds vanished. Even the wind seemed to fade away. Hours passed. Then Rose saw it. Far across the valley, a dark line stretched along the ground. At first she thought it was a shadow, but the line moved. It grew wider and darker until she realized what she was seeing. Water. A massive wall of muddy water racing down the valley. Trees and branches rolled inside it like broken toys, and it was heading straight for Copper Creek. Bo rode into town at full speed. Mud flew from the chestnut horse's hooves as he pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. "Flood coming!" he shouted. People turned to look at him. Some stared in confusion. Others rolled their eyes. Sheriff Burroughs stepped out onto the porch with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Well, look what the wind dragged in," he said with a smirk. "Callahan looking for trouble again?" Bo glared at him. "I'm trying to save your town," Burroughs laughed. "It ain't rained in 6 weeks. That's the problem," Bo snapped. "The snowmelt's been building up in the canyon." Some of the townsfolk began whispering. Then the ground trembled, just a little at first, but enough that the horses tied along the street began stomping and pulling at their reins. A deep roar rolled down from the northern hills. The sheriff's smile slowly faded. Bo did not wait another second. He ran down the street, pounding on doors. "Get to high ground!" he shouted. "Now!" Some people hesitated. Others refused to believe him. Bo grabbed an old man by the arm and dragged him toward the hill behind the church. He carried a crying woman's baby while she stumbled beside him through the mud. He lifted a frightened boy onto his shoulders and ran. The roar grew louder. Then the flood hit. The first wave slammed into the edge of town like a wild animal. Water rushed through the streets, knocking barrels and wagons aside. Within seconds, it rose to Bo's knees, then his waist. The current shoved against him so hard, he nearly lost his footing. He grabbed a hitching post and held himself steady. A scream cut through the chaos. A small child clung to a porch railing with water swirling around his chest. His fingers slipped. Bo lunged forward. The current slammed into him, but he forced his way through it. Just as the boy's grip gave out, Bo grabbed his wrist. "I got you!" he shouted. The child clung to him as Bo fought back toward higher ground. Mrs. Morrison reached down from a rooftop and pulled the boy into her arms. Bo turned immediately and ran back into the water. He cut a trapped man loose from a broken wagon. He lifted a woman through a window before the current smashed the building apart. He dragged Tom Morrison himself out of the rushing water when the man's injured wrist got caught on a nail. For nearly 2 hours, Bo battled the flood. His hands tore open from gripping ropes and wood. His arms burned from pulling people to safety. But he never stopped. By the time the water finally began to lower, the sun was setting behind the mountains. The town looked broken. Mud covered the streets. Half the buildings leaned crookedly. But every person was alive. Bo sank onto the church steps, exhausted. His hands were wrapped in torn strips of cloth from his own shirt. Mrs. Morrison approached slowly with her grandson standing beside her. The boy clutched her skirt. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly. Bo stared down at the muddy street. "Don't matter. It matters to me." But Bo was not listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on the road that led out of town, toward the ridge, toward the cabin, toward Rose. He pushed himself to his feet. Someone handed him a blanket. Another person offered a horse. But Bo only thought about one thing: getting home. and hoping she was still there waiting. Bo rode through the night. The chestnut horse was tired from the long day, but Bo kept urging it forward. The moon hung low above the valley, casting pale light across the muddy trails that twisted through the hills. The flood had changed the land. Whole sections of the road were gone. Water had carved new paths through fields and pastures. Twice Bo had to turn away from washed-out trails and search for another way through the darkness. His hands burned where the rope had torn the skin open earlier that day. Every time the horse stumbled, his body ached. But he kept going. Only one thought stayed in his mind. Rose. When the faint pink light of dawn finally touched the sky, Bo reached the top of the ridge overlooking the cabin. He pulled the horse to a stop. For a moment he simply sat there, breathing hard. Then he saw it. A thin ribbon of smoke curled up from the cabin chimney. Light glowed softly in the window. Bo closed his eyes for a second. She was still there. He rode down the hill slowly now, letting the tired horse pick its way across the wet grass. Rose stood on the porch, holding a tin cup in both hands. Her hair had come loose from its braid, and the morning breeze lifted the soft strands around her face. She had been watching the ridge, waiting. When Bo reached the yard, he slid from the saddle. His legs shook as soon as his boots touched the ground. Rose stepped forward quietly and took the horse's reins from his hand. "I'll see to him," she said gently. Bo tried to speak, but no sound came out. Rose studied his face. Mud covered his clothes. His hands were wrapped in rough bandages, and his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "You should go inside," she said. Bo nodded once and walked toward the cabin door. Inside the warm room, the smell of fresh coffee and baked biscuits filled the air. He barely made it to the bed before the weight of the long night pulled him down. Sleep came instantly. When Bo woke again, sunlight streamed through the window. For a moment he was confused. Then he saw Rose sitting near the window with a sewing needle in her hand. She was quietly repairing one of his shirts. She looked up and smiled when she saw his eyes open. "There's coffee on the stove," she said softly, "and biscuits." Bo slowly pushed himself upright. Pain spread through every muscle in his body. "Town still standing?" he asked. Rose nodded. "I rode to the ridge this morning. I could see the church roof. Looks like folks are cleaning up." Bo rubbed his tired eyes. "They all made it out?" "So it seems." He let out a long breath. Rose rose from the chair and walked toward him. "You came back," she said. "Told you I would." For a moment, they stood there, looking at each other. Then Rose gently took one of his injured hands in both of hers. Her touch was warm and careful. "You did a good thing," she said quietly. Bo shrugged a little. "Just did what needed doing." But Rose saw the truth behind the simple words. The town that had feared him. The people who whispered about him behind closed doors. He had saved them anyway. The weeks that followed brought slow changes to the valley. The flood had left mud and broken wood everywhere, but the people of Copper Creek worked together to rebuild. Word spread quickly about what Bo Callahan had done. For the first time in years, people began speaking his name with respect instead of fear. One afternoon, Bo stood outside the cabin repairing a fence when he heard a horse approaching along the trail. He turned and saw Tom Morrison riding toward him. Bo leaned against the fence post as the man stopped his horse. Tom climbed down slowly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Tom held out his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said. Bo looked at the hand. "You saved my life in that flood," Tom continued. "And my boys, too." Bo shook the man's hand once. "That's enough for me." Tom nodded. As he mounted his horse again, he glanced toward the cabin where Rose stood in the doorway, watching. Town's talking about you two, he said with a small smile. Bo raised an eyebrow. Preacher's riding through next week. Tom tipped his hat. Might be a good time for a wedding. After he rode away, Rose stepped down from the porch. You heard him, she said. Bo rubbed the back of his neck. Well, folks do seem to think it's a good idea. Rose walked closer until she stood beside him. And what do you think? Bo looked out across the meadow for a moment. The grass had grown tall again after the flood. The creek sparkled under the afternoon sun. Finally, he looked back at her. I think, he said slowly, this place feels like home now. Rose smiled. So do I. They were married the following Sunday. It was a quiet ceremony beside the creek behind the cabin. A few people from town came to stand among the willow trees. Even Mrs. Morrison arrived with a basket of flowers and a proud smile. Rose wore a simple white muslin dress she had sewn herself. Bo wore his cleanest shirt and a ring he had made from an old copper penny his father once gave his mother many years ago. The preacher spoke softly, while the creek murmured nearby. When Bo slipped the copper ring onto Rose's finger, the sunlight flashed across the metal. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rose looked up at him. Funny thing, she said softly. The day I stepped off that train, I thought I had lost everything. Bo took her hand gently. Turns out, she continued, smiling, I was just finding my way here. That evening they sat together on the porch, wrapped in a warm blanket, as the stars filled the sky above the valley. The wind moved gently through the willow trees, and the creek whispered in the dark. Rose rested her head against Bo's shoulder. Bo, she said quietly. Yeah? This is home. Bo looked out across the land that had once felt empty. Now it felt full of life, full of quiet promises. He pulled her a little closer. Yeah, he said softly. It sure is.